All right, so let's just jump right into it. It's been a while since we had our 30-minute pre interview conference. But one thing that I like to talk about all of my guests about actually is kind of their own personal evolution of race consciousness. And what I mean by that is, you know, learning about being black, learning about different races in the world and what it meant. How did you come into that knowledge, and what impact did coming into that knowledge have on your life?
Wow, that's a tough one because I don't really view it. So I've been through phases in a lot of this, and I think probably uh, you know I get it. Like I've had the events as a kid or as a young person where you certain societal messages were delivered, um, and you just I guess I accepted it as the norm. But it was when I became more of an adult that I started thinking through some of this stuff. And even then, like in my early adulthood, certain things that I look back now and I'm thinking to myself, wow, that was kind of messed up. But back then it was just the norm. And that's sort of how life tends to be when you live in a situation. You don't notice some of the things that are going on around you. And then you reach a different place in your life and you look back and you can think on things differently.
Can
Um,
you give us an example of one of those things if you can?
Ooh, really? Okay. All right. So I wasn't gonna let this one out, but I remember in college. So I went to school in a town where there weren't a lot of black students. There were a good amount, but it's a tiny minority overall. And I remember how common it was when, I was a bouncer at a bar, and a guy would see a girl and he'd like her, he'd think she was cute. And it was very common for him to ask the question, hey, is she into black guys? And back then, that was just a question. Oh, you're like, yeah, yeah, she is. Or you might say, no, no, that one isn't. And now, like, as an older person, as an adult, older adult, I look back and I'm like, that is a really messed up question to have to ask as a black guy. Is like, does this person consider me okay to date purely based on, you know, whatever racial thing hangups are there? And that's kind of, now I look back, I'm like, that's kind of messed up. But it was very normal. Like this question wouldn't have like raised an eyebrow going any direction, right? So like, um, even a white guy coming by hearing a black guy say that wouldn't react because it wouldn't have stood out as a strange question to ask. It was like, yeah, that's a reasonable question. So, now I'm older, I look back and I think that was weird. But I guess a part of getting older and thinking more about these issues separate from my own like personal experience is you come to different conclusions. I think probably one thing that's really changed, I sort of try to look more at a bigger picture than just like the moment in which I live kind of thing. And so yeah, that's changed a good amount about even my views because I became a Rasta, and for some of the people who know Rasta is a very like Rasta was it was before the whole Black Power movement, but in a way it tied in really well, right? Like the UNIA and that stuff came through Garvey, um, but a lot of Rastafari philosophy was really pushed into the Black Power movement as well, and then so it's kind of interesting coming through that movement and then getting to sort of the place where I am on race. But at the same time, it's weird as a Rasta because it still fits because like Haile Selassie, who's the figurehead or the central character for Rastas, he had a very famous quote, the one that Bob Marley put in his song, which is until the color of a man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes, everywhere will be war, right? And so that was from him, and so he had this view that like our push has to be towards getting to a place where it means nothing. It carries no effect in the world. Of course, I might disagree with some people about like how you do that, whether you do it by ignoring it. But he wanted it to get to the place where it has no power. But you can't ignore its power and say it has no power simply because I'm ignoring it.
part of the reason I started these conversations is because something that's missing from them is oftentimes the historical legacy of white supremacy, in terms of, the laws, the political maneuvering, the murdering, the corruption that has fueled racism in the country, for generations. And that part of it, I notice, especially particularly coming from conservative voices, it's only mentioned to minimize it oftentimes, or as a way of saying, well, we know this exists, but, right? As like a preface to some other kind of statement. And I find that very worrisome, because I'm not sure how you can critically analyze where we are today in terms of race relations without actually making central the extraordinary powers that worked in concert to make sure that Black Americans remained on the bottom of a artificially created racial hierarchy. What do you think about that?
I have nothing to add because that's absolutely correct. Right? Like, it does get me in a lot of other contexts as well, where I often have to remind people that none of their analysis, none of these social dynamics exist in a vacuum, right? So it's not like one day Black people just woke up and said, you know what? I think we want to live in the worst neighborhoods. I think we want to deal with the most pollution. Like, I like pollution. Like, no one sat there and thought. And honestly, maybe we'll get into it later, but like, even the cultural arguments, that's how I view them too. There's no day that Black people just woke up and said, you know what? I don't think we need enough men. We need so many men in our communities. I think we should find a place that we should send them to. Right. So like, people have sort of these ideas that, a lot of these things just spring out of some, cultural ether. And they when you point to them, and when figures point them to the history of, like, here's how this came to be, and a lot of them, put their fingers in their ears and cover their eyes and say, no, I can't hear you, I can't see. And then as soon as they stop, they're like, okay, so back to why, none of that history matters. Right. So I agree with you, but sometimes I wonder, is like, how do you get that across? And some people we can reach. I think that's where I've changed. I've come to the idea that some people we can reach, and that in some cases I may have been historically naive about some other people. But you kind of accept some people aren't going to be on the same page. And you go for those you can reach. You find those people, and that's who you try to pull in a better direction, and then move with them together.
Yeah, I think that's a great mindset to have about this. But, in terms of how do we do it, I think it's important to recognize that we haven't really tried. We have not really been trying to educate people about this subject matter pretty much ever. So
I don't know if I agree with that one, because here's the thing I say. When you look back 50 years ago, let's go 50 years, when you were talking about things like civil rights, right, and Black civil rights, you had Black activists and you had the Black population arguing for, hey guys, we're human too, I remember the picket signs, I'm a man, right? Like, very simple, basic stuff. And you had a few white people. Like, MLK talked about in his letter, actually, I don't remember, I think it was a letter to the sociologist, where he was talking about, the white people that are actually helping in protests, or some of the ones who were joining in the riots. He actually mentioned them, right? But back then, that was a few people, and when you see the pictures, the old photos, it stands out. Oh wow, cool. There are some white activists there too. But come forward now to our time, I actually think what I will call the anti-racist white group it's much bigger. It is a much larger percentage, and that didn't come from nowhere. That came from the work. That came from these types of things, putting it out there, explaining to people, talking to people, showing them. And I think we've moved a lot of people to the point where, and Liam Bright sort of mentioned this in a thing where he joked about, like, essentially a lot of this culture war, woke, whatever stuff is, it's a social white civil war, right? Where two sides are actively fighting about what direction to take on racism, right? Whether to leave it in place or make it worse or enough. And I think I actually completely agree with that. So some of the fights that we encounter where people are like, oh, the woke are doing this and the woke are doing that, I welcome it generally, because to me, I know who they're tagging as woke. And I know the term itself is BS. I've said that repeatedly. But the who they will throw that term at, it's essentially back in the old days, it's race traitors, right? That's what a lot of it really is, right? It's people who have violated the contract, if you will, of white identity. Here's what you should stand for. You should not be, helping those N-words. And sometimes I get like this. You should not be helping those N-words right now, and you are therefore in the wrong. But I think the fact that that group that is willing to take it is getting bigger is a sign of that progress. And honestly, it is what gives me the most hope, because I see the momentum continues when, the right and their allies are now complaining about cancel culture. And the cancel culture they're complaining is, this guy said the N-word and a bunch of white kids got mad at him. To me and you, that's a sign of progress. To them, it is a sign of decline. But their sorrow at those events is my joy.
And mine as well. Absolutely. I definitely agree with you that those are a sign of progress. The greater percentage of white individuals who are now educating themselves and learning more about this. But I just want to make sure that I narrow my original point, which is, when I say that we haven't really tried to, I just mean that we haven't really tried to mass teach people about race.
Oh, that's true.
That's all I mean.
Yeah.
and I think that a lot of the increase in the percentage of non-black people who are into anti-racism, a lot of it has to do with a combination of interracial marriages and biracial children and multiracial children, and social media and technology in general that has connected us more and allowed people to kind of see the world around them that was hidden from them in the past.
Yes. And in a nice way, so those factors, especially things like social media, has given people something they wouldn't have normally had access to, because it is not easy, and I won't even pretend it's easy to go and say, what, I'm going to go teach myself about the history of racism. But in a conversation, and this is sort of where you and I actually spend a lot of time, is we might be talking to somebody and somebody's like, wait, what are you talking about? Like, that doesn't make sense. And then you show them something from history and they read it and their response is, that's messed up. They didn't know it before. They might not have even been able to find it. And for you and I, it may be common knowledge, right? So them seeing it, they now have access to voices. And I've seen stats about people's social networks, how, the average white American social network might, if they're very, very lucky, have one black person, right? But most do not. Like, let's say the 10 closest friends, most don't have that. But on social media, it closes that obstacle. That network comes closer. So suddenly you and I and others, like, we're not central or anything, but people can reach out and ask for some information, and there are enough people willing to share. And then once people see some of this stuff, and you're right, if there was mass education, a lot of this stuff would immediately stand out as holy crap, right? But I'll give credit to the ones that put the effort out there. And yeah, that information, that social media is really helping people to see some of the stuff they wouldn't have normally seen.
Absolutely.
Include some of the other things, right? Like, people talk about the social attitudes, even around, as you mentioned, like, quote unquote interracial marriage, like that, seeing these things and seeing, honestly, Black people as normal people closes, it opens minds, people no longer will react to seeing, a person who they label as black and a person they label as white in a relationship, right? Whereas even 20 years ago, that might have been like, oh, well, that's different.
Yeah, I mean, I see it all the time, and my mom and I talk about it sometimes about how normalized it's become, and that's great. Like it's wonderful to see. I want to make sure that on this show that I don't get bogged down, not expressing that progress has been made, because so much progress has been made. It's all around us. It's obvious. The reason I don't spend so much time harping on it, I guess, is because I feel like a lot of times people bring it up in order to kind of dissuade people from talking about the actual issues that still exist, or to cover them. So one of those issues that you talk a lot about on social media is scientific racism, or also biological race realism. So do you want to tell people a little bit about what those are, and what your interest in that topic is?
So I classify those two things as different. So the biological race realism is just the people that believes that race is what they say is a biological reality. Like you're mapping out there's a real group of black, biological category of black, and person A or person B belongs in that. And people will say, oh, it's just a way of labeling, but it's actually more than that. There are claims as to how connected those two individuals are. So they would say, okay, that person's black and you're black, therefore you are like them. And that is always the implication. And some people will pretend, but it really is the fundamental implication. And it was even called out by some of the scientists back in the day that really that's what you're saying with these categories, is that, these two random black people are more alike than they are to somebody else who's not in that group. So that's biological race realism, is that idea. The other one is scientific racism, which is generally built on top of it, of biological race realism, which is more that, yes, these groups exist, these races exist, they're real, and the things we see in the world, the social outcomes we see where, in society, black people might graduate less from college, is a reflection of innate, evolved differences, inferiorities in their capabilities and traits. And generally, they'll be talking about like genetic. They have worse, black people, this black race that evolved to have worse genes for going to college, for staying out of jail, for staying off drugs. Like, so that's the hereditary and sort of scientific racism. And what they will do is they'll see almost any negative social outcomes where black people are worse. And instead of saying, hey, we should work on fixing that, or previous political actions led to here, they will say that is primarily a result of just who they are.
Okay, yeah, that was a really good summary. So why is this making a comeback? Didn't we get rid of this?
I don't think it is making a comeback, in fairness. So again, the same thing that we mentioned about social media allows things to be amplified. So in terms of the public sphere, these guys generally aren't walking around giving that many talks anymore. But because on social media, you might have one person who's a scientific racist and they have a Twitter account, and now, okay, 20,000 people follow them or 30,000 people follow them, and their message is being heard. We come across it and the Twitter algorithm works, and you see it somewhere in your network. You hear about a story at some college involving one of them. So they're not more, they're less now, but they're louder, just as everybody else is louder. So in a weird way, the same way we are more successful at getting the message out about the impacts of racism, even with our smaller numbers, these people are more successful at getting their message out about black inferiority because of like the social media. So social media amplifies every voice, right? So regardless of numbers. So I think there's less of them. They're just louder, and we still have the same work to do.
What about the reception of those ideas? Because something that I've noticed is that actually a lot of people are quite receptive to them. That's really what kind of worried me about it, is not really like the number of voices, but more what I saw, how I saw people receiving the ideas.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that because if one of the things I definitely set out to deal with on Twitter is how normal there. Like I accept that there are going to be people who like welcome these ideas. What I'm not okay with it is with these ideas being seen as normal. And so what I will not do for people, because I've had conversations with some of them, and I will be very clear, this is what they're saying. And I won't, some of them want you to sanitize it or they'll say steel man it. No. Like it is not my job to ever make them feel like what they believe is somehow acceptable socially, morally, in any way, right? And then what I do is I try to throw another angle onto it, or it shouldn't be acceptable empirically. And that I think gives us an additional edge. I will be very explicit in stating the immorality of their position, sure. But at the same time, I don't focus as much on the immorality. I focus on the fact that they are weak. They are weak scientifically, they're weak empirically. Essentially, their whole belief system doesn't hold together. But I will hold this against sort of what I would call the centrist in it. The approach isn't, oh, just do the research and debate them. That is stupid. Sorry to put it mildly, it's stupid, right? We have to be very forceful in demonstrating the weakness of their ideas, right? And so what some people will do, and credit to those people, is to forcefully reject their ideas, forcefully show the science, show the data, take them on, right? Not just like, debate will happen in some vacuum somewhere, but we bring that debate to them and not really debate on an equal level, because I'll be honest, none of them are my equals, right? We bring the debate as in, here are the facts we have, the science we have, the history that we have. Their ideas are useless, they're weak, and yes, they are immoral. And what I'm blessed or lucky to have is, I think, generally speaking, when these come about, people can see it. Because I do believe, for the most part, in people's ability to logic and reason as well. And so I think when we show people these facts, a lot more people are saying, oh, wow, he's got a point, right? Like these ideas don't really hold up to scrutiny. And most of the times, scientific racists, they don't actually want people, they will say we want debate. They don't. They don't want people digging in, because most of the arguments I see from them sometimes will be so superficial that they only stand because people don't dig in. And the moment you dig in and you force them to say explicitly what they're playing around with, you see how quickly a lot of it falls apart. So,
Yeah, I mean, I guess in those scenarios when I have seen that, the individual kind of reacts like a cornered dog or something, like, I mean, like lunging out at everything and like just kind of lashing out, but there's not a lot of productivity that happens after that cornering, as far as I've seen. Much different than what you were describing earlier in terms of like presenting evidence to people who are going to then accept it and try to internalize new information into what they already know.
The point is never then, honestly. It is never the scientific racist. So some people will say, like, don't talk to them. I disagree, really, right? I don't speak to them because I believe I will change their mind. And I'm not talking about the person who, is very marginal, who's just on the border of like, okay, maybe these ideas seem reasonable. I'm talking about like the people who are actually committed. I'm not going to change their mind. Like, they didn't arrive at their belief system by logic and reason. Logic and reason won't get them out of it. The point is to show to other people how weak those people are, mentally and otherwise. And so I want to empower others to be able to reflect, think, and change their mind, and now be empowered with There was a book by Adam Rutherford, right, which is that science is a weapon for anti-racism, and I agree with that. By presenting stuff on genetics became a hobby horse of mine. Like, here's genetic information, here's the biological consensus, here's the papers on these things. Now my friends on Twitter who see these conversations, they might have a random friend who's not hardcore, who might pop up some of these ideas and they get, hey, buddy, here's a paper that just shows like this doesn't make sense, or here's a thread just talking about it, right? Like things like that. I find that to be the point of it, more so than debating one of those guys for the sake of changing their mind.
John McWhorter's recent kind of prescription for Black America, improving Black Americans' lives, right? And he said it before. He said it on his blogging heads .tv, the Glenn Show, and so I was aware of it. But it just, every time I hear it, it strikes me as a couple things. Number one, very elementary and basic, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but also, like, you've been talking about the same prescription for all these years, and it's very basic. But what steps are we taking to move that forward? And it kind of was the same thing that I was thinking when you were just talking, because, both our federal and local state governments are stalled in a lot of ways. Not in passing critical race theory laws, obviously, but in terms of actually passing policies that benefit the constituency. We're not really hitting that out of the park in any way, shape, or form in most locations in this country. It's pretty much non-existent. And so it's interesting to me, because I always hear this conversation about how, we care about how you're doing it, not what you're doing, but how you're doing it, this and that. But like, I'm always looking at the reality of the situation being like, we're not doing anything. We're not trying to improve people's lives here.
So I am a civil libertarian generally. I don't fundamentally believe government is really all that good. So it kind of goes to the point when government screws up. And most of my prescriptions about almost every topic are more social than governmental. So for me, I wouldn't think the solution is in government, passing policy. That can come, and ideally that comes, and that tends to come in bits and pieces, and when it suits people, sure. But I believe the group that I've been speaking about, the ones who are sort of actively, paying attention, the ones who are actively saying this is bad, do something. And I've mentioned to someone's like, well, what can I do? Short of voting a certain way or whatever, what can I do? And it was funny because, like, I said to somebody, hey, you are an accomplished person, you're an academic. Give some of your time explicitly. Hey, there's a neighborhood over here that's considered a bad neighborhood. I'm going to go there and I'm going to spend, 5 hours, even a month, start somewhere, 5 hours a month talking to these children. I'm going to take one child and help them. And I don't think this necessarily scales, sure. But it, to me, is people putting their efforts where their mouth is. And that, to me, because I believe it's more social momentum, I think that has a bigger impact than even we give it credit for. Because when that person goes into that community and makes a change, and as you said, when they see that child change, like improve, their life improves, now their mentality is different. It is very much different when you see yourself as an activist who gets something done versus an activist who thinks a certain way. It is very meaningfully different in my view. And I think that momentum will build for that person. They will talk to another person. They will reach in their network. A kid will come by and say, hey, I'm looking for a job. And I said something even as simple. If you say you are anti-racist and you see a Black kid come in and say, hey, you know what? I think I could do a job, but I haven't been able to get a shot at it, give them a shot. And be explicit. I am giving you a shot because Sure, I believe in you, right? And I think things like that, active things like that by those who are saying they're committed to these things will have a downstream effect throughout society. And I think policy comes with time sometimes, right? Um, Eventually, those people's numbers will increase to the point where they have that ability, with less resistance politically, to make change. And honestly speaking, we saw it from the backlash, not just the backlash, but the reaction after George Floyd, right? Where sure, we're not looking at it and saying, wow, there's a great utopia of policy changes, but there were some, right?
I mean, barely. The George Floyd Act didn't get passed.
Not that one, but other things were done. Socially, other things were. So this is I'm an incrementalist. I don't fundamentally believe people will do big things. It just doesn't happen. I can't remember it ever happening in history.
In an emergency, that's when people do big things.
And they do big bad things in an emergency generally, right? But like good things don't usually come like that. Historically, we don't have any that we could point at where like a really good thing was done. Like, oh man, this is a really bad moment. Let's give everybody healthcare. Like, like that would be great, but it just doesn't happen. So I'm okay with just accepting moving the needle on people.
All right. I definitely don't. I mean, I definitely don't accept that. I think that there's a first time for everything. Like that, it can happen at any time that we decide to do something good. You know, it's not by accident that it doesn't happen. You know, like, so I mean, ultimately, like acceptance of that is acceptance of like the power dynamics that create that situation from never occurring.
But well, somewhat yes. But here's the thing: if someone, like, let's say you do that, you're arguing for big. I will never stand in opposition of the person arguing for big. I'm a cynic at heart, and I don't believe that those same dynamics you're speaking to will let big happen. But if all I need to contribute to big is support you and vote with you, I'm with you. It doesn't mean I believe that big will happen, right? And honestly, like some of the academics we've been around, like history, I don't know, man. History doesn't give much reason for big hope. But at the same time, I'm not going to pull down a person who has big hope.
Yeah, I mean, me either. I'm not trying to pull down anyone's hope, but I just want to be realistic. To be honest, I think I'm more hopeful than most. Like, I think
that's what I'm saying. Like, you're hopeful of like the big thing being done, and I see myself as more like, will they let that big thing happen? But if it does, good, right? And I get in a weird way, it's me with the whole race thing, right? Where, like in my ideal world, racism disappears and race goes away. And somebody will look at me and say, like, but will it anytime soon though? And I'm like, well, I'm hopeful, but I'm still realistic.
I hear you, brother. We just have to wait and see. I think it's very hard to tell what's about to happen to us. To be honest, things are breaking down all around us. Systems are failing. People are suffering. People are being traumatized in all kinds of new and inventive ways. People are getting addicted to all kinds of new and inventive things. There's a lot of kind of hopelessness being kind of passed around. There's drug epidemic, and a lot of these social problems and medical problems are being fueled by government policy. So it's interesting to me that you think that we shouldn't focus on policy, or we should focus at the interpersonal or social level.
Oh no, not like that. No. So the reason I'm saying I would never tear down somebody who's pushing on policy is I do accept. So like back in the day where like the NWCP and the SNCC were going at it, one group was like, we have to agitate, we have to act, and the NWC like we gotta change policy. And I actually believe it's the same team. It's fundamentally the same team. The person who's pushing to change policy is on my team. and I'm cheering for them and I'm hoping for them and I will support them as much as possible. And regardless of the fact that regardless of whether I think they will get a big thing, I still believe they will get small things. I do actually generally believe small things will happen because people are much more willing to chip away. I mean, those in power are much more willing to let things chip than to let things fall. And I accept that. And at the same time, I believe that on an activist side as well, so separate from the political activist side, you need social activism because you have to build that coalition. And I feel like there are both sides, both players in this game, I guess, are needed. You need the social activists to give power and to empower the political activists.
Totally agree. Yep, totally agree with that. What would be the one thing that we would do to try to improve Black Americans' lives that's like realistic to accomplish? And my answer was to create a national mentoring program that's like sustainable and replenishable for black youth. I really do think that what you just described there and can be described in many other ways in terms of making people giving people validation of the experience that they're going through, because that's something a lot of black students don't get. They get the opposite of that oftentimes.
Yeah, did that really happen to you? Is that right? What you think you saw? Yeah. Oh no, I've been there.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and not just that, but like even sometimes like, you know, people redirecting blame back onto them,
Mm-hmm.
even if they're blameless, or even if there's
Yeah.
nothing they could have done. And it can be very confusing for a student, and it can make people who were perfectly competent and confident before lose both of those.
Dims the light.
It does, and I can remember moments in my own life where that happened. I didn't really have the kind of support that you're talking about. So it's
Mm-hmm.
wonderful to hear that you're offering that to people. I do the same as much as I can, and hopefully, anyone else in a position to mentor any student, but also particularly black students will engage in that process of mentorship with
And
them.
and I will extend that, right? So it's not even just like, yes, there's an additional perspective added by like, Black people in their careers mentoring like these kids. But honestly, a lot of my personal mentors have not been Black. And I would not have traded any of those people because they significantly helped me. So like any like person, white person listening to this who's thinking, is it okay if I go and mentor a Black person? Absolutely, please do. Right? Like that Black kid or a young person looking at their career, getting you as a mentor, the amount of doors you could open for them, the least important factor in that is your quote unquote race, right? Like it doesn't matter. If you are helping improve their life, they don't care what race you are, right? Like I've always found that funny. Like if a white person helps me, and I've had that obviously, but if a white person helps make my life better, helps me develop as a person, I welcome that. Like it is not a thing to be concerned about. And any white person listening, absolutely, if you can help mentor or give an opportunity to somebody, jump at it, right?
100%. I mean, I don't know why anyone would hesitate because the person who could be your mentee is a different race than you. I think that
No,
is,
I get it. I actually do get it because
I don't get it. But
they're
also,
worried. they're worried. They're worried about and this is a fair one. Sometimes you do have some people, and I've seen it sometimes on Twitter, where a white person is trying to do a good thing, and they get attacked. And they get attacked. Yes, they might be used to the attack from some other white people, but unfortunately, sometimes there are some contingents of like Black people who will see a white person doing something good and think, "Oh, you're trying to be a white savior." And honestly, I'm not a big fan of those people. I want to encourage that person who's doing a good thing that even though you will sometimes get hit with an arrow, you're doing it for the right reason. Stick to it. It is actually a benefit.
yeah, I mean, I think the way to avoid those arrows is by making sure that you really are helping the person who you're trying to mentor. That you're
Mm-hmm.
not trying to be serve as some kind of Jesus Christ savior figure for them who knows everything about how they can advance in the world, and if they'd only just follow your yellow brick road that you've laid out for them. Like,
Oh, I completely agree with that.
yeah, I mean, I think that it frankly, if a small group of outspoken black people criticizing a good act is enough for you to be too fearful to engage in it, I don't see how we're really going to make progress in this space. You know, like, I mean, people get murdered over trying to fix this situation.
But
Like,
not everybody is themselves that tough necessarily walking in. And I rather encourage that person who, might not be tough, but has their heart in the right place. And I rather know that, we are there as, not all of us, but we will be there as your support to encourage you. And actually, I'll point out one of our friends on Twitter, right? There's this, his name is also a carpenter, so Bradley Mason. Like, he writes a bunch of historical stuff about CFT, for example.
he's going to be on the show on February 8th, FYI, if everybody wants to see our conversation.
I love that guy. And he takes a bunch of arrows, right? From sometimes Christian people, sometimes other white people, and they say all sorts of mean things to him. And sometimes I've seen sometimes the other way, right? He will get in an argument with Black Christians, and they're throwing the arrows at him too. But at the end of the day, Bradley is the one doing the thing that is making things better. And so I think it is important for some people, some of us especially, to encourage a person like that. And I'm not talking about giving out cookies, right? Like, ally cookies or anything like that. But encourage that person that, hey, you know what? Even though you're taking those arrows, even though sometimes it feels painful and feels hard, you're doing the right thing and you're appreciated. And I do think people do appreciate people who do that. But I don't think it's a bad thing to publicly even appreciate those people. And sometimes we feel like, hey, are we like giving out those cookies, as I said? But no, it helps. It's helpful because you want to build that person up, because I've always had more respect for people who get involved in a fight that they do not have any skin in the game for. So like, back in the abolitionists, for example, abolitionists didn't have to do anything. And in some cases it was illegal. They were putting their lives on the line and they did it. And to me, that type of mentality of like, you know what, I gain nothing except knowing that I'm doing the right thing. I believe in encouraging those people. So we see it today still like on Twitter and stuff like that.
I hear that perspective. I don't like saying that people don't have skin in the game. I think everybody has skin in this game, and I get what you mean by that. But I think the mindset that only certain people have skin in the race game is.
That's true. I agree with you. No, yeah. You're right. That's a good point.
We talked about Dave Chappelle. Seems like a lifetime ago. Like, is he even still around? Is he still making comedy?
Cycle.
Yeah. He made that comment, "Inwards get killed every day." That's what I have in my quotes here. And you had a thought about him saying that to the group of students that he was speaking to, and kind of arguing back and forth with at that, I think it was a high school or something.
Yeah. I think my reaction, so the language itself doesn't fully bother me. It bothers me where? Because I don't care who you are, like whether you're on my team or a different team, you don't say that to kids. You could be realistic and tell a kid like, hey, a lot of people die in the world, right? Or a lot of people even die in this neighborhood, but you shouldn't minimize it. People getting killed is never a flippant comment, right? Especially depending where some of these people live. Right? That is a bad thing. It's fundamentally a bad thing that people are getting killed where any child lives, especially in an advanced society, right? So I don't think that message was ever okay to deliver to kids, and I would have scolded him purely on that basis, regardless of who he was. I think the thing that got me the most out of that interaction, actually, though, wasn't Dave, but the amount of people who, I bring up consistency a lot, where he said that in front of children and they were okay with it. Whereas if, you as an educator said something even mild, like, there's a greater risk you might be killed if you encounter a police officer, they would like, oh, you shouldn't be saying that to children. right? And to me,
Indoctrination.
Indoc- uh, inconsistency is probably one of my biggest pet peeves. Like I like people to be consistent, and so like to see that flip, and even in the moment on the comments that we're referring to, I saw that flip where it seemed like it was okay because Dave Chappelle was on whatever team, and realistically, I'm gonna be honest, he was on team anti-trans, right? So they were okay with him telling kids even the N word, which they would normally have had a problem with. N words get killed every day, right? And I'm like, you can't be okay with that. It makes me lose a bit more respect for you if I'm seeing you're okay with it because you like the person, because it means that your principles of like how people should talk to children, completely depends on the politics. That's not okay with me.
Yeah, I mean, I think, man, we're not just okay with talking about children that way and dehumanizing them. We'll let 20 elementary schools kids get blown away and then just like go about our day the next day. You know what I mean? So I mean, I just find that sometimes these conversations about what these celebrities do or say, or it's kind of pointless because we could just look around us and see that our society was built on dehumanization, and it's obvious. It's obvious
Sure.
today. And I think that that's not obvious to a lot of people. I don't think a lot of people, you say, yeah, I mean, I know you agree, but like, I think that the vast majority of people would not agree with what I just said. That's not kind of the
You know,
lives
it's
that
weird.
people imagine themselves living.
I think they would, but they wouldn't admit it, right?
Maybe I don't know. That to me, that's the same as not.
Because I've
But
seen it. I've seen this more sometimes from like the liberal side, right? Where to say like, okay, well, just so you know, like the country was built on genocide. We killed lots of Native people, right? And they're like, okay, yeah, but I love our country though. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but that's fine. That's a different point. But you could still acknowledge that it was built on genocide, right? Like, so I remember the conversations like, like America was racism was fundamental to the founding of America. Yes, like you could love the country and say yes. Like you don't have to deny the dehumanization, the stuff that happened. You could still come through it and love.
it's not about what people have to do, right? Like I think what's more important is that like it's people's reflex to do that.
Yes,
Like I
because
I don't think we can overlook that point because they've
yes,
people have been trained to reflexively fight against that because they've a lot of people have tied their individuality,
identity.
their personal identity exactly. I'm definitely a fan of humanity at large.
Mhm.
I try to think of myself as a humanist, and a human being before anything else. I found that has given me somewhat of an edge in terms of my thinking about the world and myself as an individual as well. And I think it's one of the biggest consequences of creating the racial hierarchy and the dehumanization that it was involved in protecting it is that a lot of people kind of have forgotten what their own humanity means. And I think that's people of all races I'm talking about. And so
Yeah.
I just think that we need to get back to that in some way, getting people to recognize each other for what we all are, which is the same, which is humans, and somehow we need to get back to that and realize that we're all in this together, whether we're in the same country, surrounded by the same borders or not. And
Yeah, I agree with that. I just, again, this is the cynic part of me. There's so many people that disagree.
yeah, I mean, people can disagree. People think the Earth is flat too. you know, people
Well,
think all
not
kinds of
40% of them,
things.
right? Like, remember what, 40% of the people voted for Trump. And that's just one example, right? Like,
Well, apparently 2/3 of Republicans think that Donald Trump should have been the rightful president still, and
there
the
you
election
go.
was stolen. So,
This is why I view things a lot on the individual stuff for social dynamics. Like, I believe you should still view everybody that way, in spite of the fact that there's a sizable amount of people that will not return the favor. They do not view you with the same humanity or hope for your success in life that you're hoping for everybody.
It is tiresome, though, to be wishing for everyone's success and having no one wishing for yours. I
Well,
guess.
lots of people wish for yours, yeah, but yeah, you're right. Yeah, I get you. You're right.
I mean, well, people will wish for it, but I'm actually like actively making people successful. Yeah, I mean,
It's good.
uh, I feel like, you know, I don't know. It's a really difficult ask to put people in that position to constantly be, you know, pure. I would say
But
is a good
see,
word.
where do you find, see, for me, and you actually hit on it before, like fulfillment doesn't come, I don't think in terms of the big stuff in terms of fulfillment. For me, fulfillment is again that moment the light comes on. Like as a teacher for you, like the moment you talk to somebody about something and it clicks and they say, "Oh, I get it." That to me is very fulfilling. And like as a parent, it is
It doesn't pay
the
the bills,
moment.
man. It doesn't pay any bills.
I'm lucky. I'm not a teacher anymore. I'm in tech now. The bills are okay. The bills are okay. But like my fulfillment in life comes from yes, those nice moments I have interacting with people, but with my babies, right? Like these kids will do the silliest, simplest little thing, and that to me will be a moment of fulfillment. So I think, and here's something I'll say to you. Historically, our like black folks have had it so hard compared to like where we are. They still had to find fulfillment in a world that looked like it was never going to be better. It was never going to be okay. They were never going to be fully people. And I don't know, I look at it that way. So almost every time I think about my own life, for example, I think back to where my grandparents or my parents were. And that's who I'm comparing to. Because yes, the whole world might be on fire, but I don't know. My fulfillment, as much as it can, will come from those small moments more so than a big political project.
You know what's funny about that is like the worse things get, I find it easier for me to find fulfillment. Much easier.
It's true. You have no
So
choice,
like,
right?
I definitely want to give the ancestors credit, but maybe they had an easier time at it.
Wow.